Something important may be happening between the United States and Canada, and most Americans still have not fully processed it. For years, the assumption in Washington was almost automatic. If the White House turned up the pressure, Ottawa would eventually give in. Canada was treated as the predictable partner, the quiet neighbor, the country that might complain a little but would ultimately stay in line because the American market was simply too important to lose. That assumption is now being tested in a serious way. President Trump built much of the public argument around strength. He threatened steep tariffs, framed Canada as a country taking advantage of U.S. workers, and presented the situation as if America held all the cards. On the surface, that message sounded simple and forceful. A lot of people in Washington seemed to believe the same thing behind closed doors. The theory was straightforward. Canada depends too much on the U.S. to risk a prolonged standoff, so if pressure increased, Canada would come back asking for terms. But that is not what this situation appears to be showing. Instead of rushing into a loud public fight, Prime Minister Mark Carney took a very different path. No dramatic speeches, no panicked reaction, no visible scrambling. And sometimes that kind of silence is the first sign that the other side is not cornered at all. Sometimes it means they are buying time, preparing a different response, and waiting for the right moment to show their hand. That seems to be the more important part of this story. While American political attention was focused on tariff threats and public messaging, Canada appears to have been working on something deeper, reducing its vulnerability. Not with symbolic gestures, not with a few headlines meant to score points, but with the kind of structural repositioning that can actually change a country's economic leverage. The idea is simple but powerful. If you believe your biggest trading partner may become unreliable, you do not just argue with them. You start building alternatives, and that is where Washington may have miscalculated. Because if Canada is seriously expanding trade ties with Europe, Asia, and other partners, then this is no longer just a dispute over tariffs. It becomes a long-term shift in how Canada sees its place in the world economy. It becomes a strategy of diversification, and diversification changes the balance of power. A country that has other doors open does not panic the same way a country with only one exit does. That matters more than most people realize. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship worked not just because of geography, but because of habit, trust, and deep integration. Supply chains were built around that reality. Energy systems were built around that reality. Manufacturers, builders, distributors, and retailers all made long-range decisions based on the assumption that this cross-border relationship was stable. Once you disrupt something like that, the effects do not stay in press conferences. They move into contracts, shipping routes, production schedules, and household budgets. That is why this issue deserves more attention than it is getting. Take lumber. American construction has long depended on Canadian wood products. If more of that supply is redirected to buyers in Asia or elsewhere, the problem for the U.S. is not just availability, it is competition. If foreign buyers are willing to pay more, American firms do not simply face delays, they face higher costs. Those costs then spread through the system. Builders pay more, developers pay more, home buyers pay more, and renters eventually feel it too. A trade conflict that starts in Washington can end up showing itself in the monthly cost of housing. Pharmaceuticals are another weak point. Millions of Americans rely on generic medications, and Canada plays an important role in that ecosystem. If supply priorities begin to shift under new international agreements, U.S. access can become less secure. That does not necessarily create instant shortages across the board, but it introduces pressure into a system that many families already experience as fragile. For people who depend on steady access to medication, even small disruptions can feel huge. Then there is energy, which may be one of the most underestimated parts of the entire picture. A lot of political rhetoric in the United States treats energy independence like a switch you can flip, but infrastructure does not work that way. Pipelines, refinery systems, regional distribution networks, and cross-border energy flows are physical systems built over years. Northern states in particular have been deeply tied to Canadian energy. That means even if politicians talk as if the U.S. can replace those links overnight, reality is slower and more stubborn. If Canada has better long-term deals elsewhere, or if its export priorities change, Americans can end up paying more before Washington comes up with a workable replacement. That is where the economic cost starts moving from abstract to personal. And that may be exactly why voices like Warren Buffett's carry so much weight in moments like this. Buffett is not reacting like a cable news commentator or a party spokesman. He is looking at incentives, systems, trust, and long-term consequences. When someone with that kind of credibility warns that America may be learning an expensive lesson, people pay attention because he is talking about more than stock prices. He is talking about what happens when a government disrupts a durable economic relationship without fully accounting for how interconnected everything has become. Markets can absorb noise. They are much less forgiving when supply chains and trust begin to break down. That is the deeper danger here. If businesses start to believe the U.S. is becoming an unpredictable trading partner, they do not wait around for the next headline. They adapt, they hedge, they look for alternatives. And once those alternatives are built, it becomes much harder to win that business back. Trust in global trade is like plumbing in a house. Most people ignore it when it works, but once it cracks, the damage spreads fast and repairs are expensive. That is also why this story is becoming political inside the United States, not just geopolitical abroad. When trade friction begins hurting real industries, state leaders notice, governors notice, lawmakers notice, especially in places that depend heavily on Canadian commerce. States such as Michigan and Minnesota are not reading this as an abstract diplomatic chess match. They are dealing with energy pressure, supply uncertainty, and the possibility of higher costs for local businesses. Once that happens, the issue stops being about rhetoric and starts becoming a governance problem. And when lawmakers in Washington begin discussing whether presidential tariff power should face more limits, that tells you something important. It suggests concern is spreading beyond partisan talking points. People do not move toward institutional restraints unless they think the risk of unilateral action has become too high. That may be one of the clearest signals in the entire story. Because at the heart of all this is a bigger question. What happens when America assumes it still controls the tempo, but the other side decides it no longer has to play by that rhythm? That may be what Carney understood earlier than Washington did. He did not need to win a shouting match. He did not need to match Trump line for line. He only needed to reduce Canada's dependence enough to change the negotiation itself. Once that happens, the whole emotional structure of the dispute changes. The side that was expected to panic becomes patient. The side that expected compliance starts looking reactive. And once a country loses that aura of control, the rest of the world notices. Europe notices. Japan notices. Latin America notices. Other medium-sized powers notice. They all start asking versions of the same question. If Canada can reduce its vulnerability through planning and diversification, why can't we? That does not mean every country will suddenly pivot away from Washington. But it does mean the old assumption that access to the U.S. market automatically guarantees obedience is becoming less certain. That is a major shift, because this is not only about tariffs anymore. It is about credibility. It is about whether America still looks like a steady partner or an impulsive one. It is about whether allies and neighbors believe U.S. policy is rooted in long-term strategy or in short-term political theater. And in global commerce, that distinction matters enormously. Countries can tolerate hard bargaining. What they struggle with is unpredictability. Meanwhile, Canada's posture in all of this has been striking. Not louder, not theatrical, not triumphant, just disciplined. That may be why it has been effective. A calm government with a clear plan can sometimes do more damage to an opponent's assumptions than a dramatic retaliation ever could. If Carney's approach really has been to quietly widen Canada's options while Washington focused on pressure tactics, then this was never about one news cycle. It was about repositioning. So where does this go from here? Trump still has choices, but none of them look easy. He can escalate and risk driving costs even higher for American consumers and businesses. He can negotiate and implicitly admit the leverage was weaker than advertised. Or he can hold course and watch the relationship keep fraying while other countries learn from Canada's example. None of those outcomes look like a fast, clean win, and that may be the most important lesson of all. Power in international trade does not belong only to the bigger economy, the louder leader, or the country with the more dramatic headlines. Sometimes power belongs to the side that plans further ahead, builds fallback options, and understands that dependence can be reduced long before a crisis becomes public. If that is what Canada has done here, then this is not just a story about one dispute between neighbors. It is a warning about what happens when confidence turns into complacency. It is a reminder that pressure does not always produce surrender. Sometimes it produces adaptation. Sometimes it pushes the other side to become less dependent, more disciplined, and more dangerous in the long run. And if the United States is only now beginning to realize that, then the real cost of this fight may be bigger than tariffs, bigger than one administration, and bigger than one headline cycle. Because once the world starts learning it may not need Washington in the way it used to, that is not a normal trade problem, that is a shift in the map of power itself.